So thank you very much for that kind introduction, and to Noreen for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. This is the first time that I'm presenting on this work, so it's a great opportunity for me to get feedback and comments. I'm looking forward to that. Just by way of a very broad introduction, as you are all, I'm sure, very well aware, Latin American immigration to the United States has increased dramatically in recent years. The number of foreign-born Latinos in the United States topped 21 million, something like that, in 2010. As this number has grown, so too has interest in the prospects for economic incorporation of this group. And within this general interest in economic incorporation, there's also been growing appreciation of the importance of women's work in particular to the economic well-being of immigrant families. So migration from Latin America to the United States has long been disproportionately male. For a long time, some of the early research on economic incorporation tended to sort of dismiss women as secondary migrants just joining their husbands in the United States, and so not necessarily very fundamental to the labor market picture for this group. In the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen a real explosion in research and interest on immigrant women and the factors that shape their employment outcomes, including a number of really important studies by some people in this room. So one of the things that they were quick to point out was that it's true that Latin American migration is disproportionately male, but there's a very large female component, so something like 45% of all adult Latinas in the United States, Latinos are women. And not only that, rates of labor force participation have also been rising among this group. So we've seen a number of important studies that have vastly increased our understanding, again, of the social and economic forces that shape their labor market outcomes, but obviously there's still a lot more work or room for further research. In particular, it's very difficult to characterize in a sort of succinct fashion the labor market processes among immigrant women. They tend to have very unstable employment histories. They work part-time and informally in large numbers. And so a number of our standard sources for economic data, nationally representative sources, don't necessarily capture some of the important variation in employment outcomes among these women. And even more than that, a lot of these studies also overwhelmingly lack data on things like documentation and things that are particularly important for this group. In addition, another promising area area in need of future research is more work that really takes women as the starting point and thinks more critically about the things that are unique to immigrant women and doesn't just try to fit them within some of the larger paradigms and theories that were developed to address labor market incorporation for men. And finally, another big trend that we've seen in immigration in recent years has been a very substantial dispersal of particularly the Latino population outside of traditional immigrant receiving areas to new destinations across the Southeast and Midwest. So while we have a number of important studies, particularly quantitative studies at the national level, and some very interesting in-depth qualitative studies in places like California and other traditional immigrant receiving areas, our understanding of these labor market processes among immigrant Latinas in new destinations is comparatively weak and rudimentary. So lots of area for future research and to try and address some of these limitations in the literature. The work that I'm going to be presenting on today applies an intersectionality approach to the labor supply of immigrant Latinas in Durham, North Carolina, which is one of the new destinations that has sprung up in recent years. Intersectionality is a concept that comes out of feminist scholarship and was devised to really highlight the fact that the experiences of minority women don't neatly parallel the experiences of minority men. So the idea is that concepts such as race, class, gender, they can't neatly be separated from one another. Instead, they're very inherently, intricately linked to one another, and that instead of just looking at the additive effect of all of these different levels of disadvantage, we really need to do more to consider the interaction between these different dimensions. So building on this idea, I'm going to take a broad look at the labor supply behavior of immigrant women in North Carolina, focusing on three main realms that interact and work together to shape labor market outcomes. specifically looking at conditions in the low-wage labor market, the low-wage immigrant labor market in particular in Durham, also the legal environment and how that shapes employment behaviors, and finally family constraints and how they also relate to these other two domains. So just to give a little bit of brief background on each of these different spheres of influence of immigrant women's employment patterns. We've seen a lot of research in recent years that has emphasized structural changes to the U.S. labor market and the labor markets of other industrialized nations or advanced economies. We've heard a lot about how things like deregulation, deindustrialization, globalization have all combined to really, first of all, dramatically increase inequality in economic returns by skill, but also to fundamentally erode work and labor conditions in the lower end of the occupational distribution. So we know that real wages, for example, in the lower end have either stagnated or declined, and there's also been a tremendous increase in things like employment instability, non-standard work arrangements, things like part-time and contingent work, subcontracting, even informal employment have grown a lot in recent years, again in this lower segment of the labor market. So as conditions in the low-wage labor market have deteriorated, the share of immigrants who hold those jobs has risen. So if you went back as recently as 1980, only about 12% of all low-wage workers or low-skilled workers in the United States were immigrants. Whereas today that number is closer to 50%. And not only are immigrants a growing part of this sector of the economy, immigrant women are also increasingly taking these jobs as well. So downgraded manufacturing and the explosive growth of caring fields and domestic services and personal care, things like child care and elder care, are increasingly taken by women. And so again, immigrant women are really central to understanding the low-wage labor market, and the low-wage labor market is really central to understanding the economic incorporation of immigrant women. Within this bifurcated labor market, we've also seen substantial changes in the legal environment in recent years. Again, as a number of people in this room have documented quite extensively, we've seen a very marked deterioration in the social, economic, and political climate of workers in recent years. Could very easily spend the entire hour talking only about these trends, but suffice it to say that at least since the 1980s, with the Immigration Reform and Control Act and the imposition of employer sanctions for the hiring of undocumented labor, and we've seen tremendous increase in these sanctions with a more punitive immigrant enforcement drift to our immigration policy. In general, we've seen, again, a marked deterioration in the work conditions for undocumented labor. So segments of the economy that are reliant on immigrant labor have seen a tremendous shift towards things like subcontracting and informality. And not only are immigrants increasingly consigned to the low-wage labor market, but undocumented immigrants in particular are growing in substantial share. So nearly a quarter of all low-skilled workers in the U.S. today are undocumented immigrants. And so it's, again, within this environment of bifurcated economy and worsening conditions for undocumented workers that immigrant women in particular also come to negotiate for more egalitarian relations within the family. So in addition to balancing these constraints stemming from the labor market and legal status, they also have to face the constraints imposed by the family responsibilities. So among the general population, not only among immigrants, in spite of tremendous progress in recent decades, women still bear disproportionate responsibility for family reproduction. So women's labor supply decisions are influenced quite powerfully by the demand for non-market household work. And among the general population, women with children are still less likely to work than those without. When you focus more in particular on the immigrant Latino community, there's also this idea that their family arrangements are more patriarchal than even the general population. There's a lot of, you could certainly contest that characterization. Obviously, there's a lot of variability in things like patriarchy, both within and across societies. But clearly, within the realm of labor market studies, there's some clear indications that this is an even more important constraint among Latino families than among other families. For example, Latinas Married Latinas have lower rates of labor force participation, irrespective of the presence of children. This is the case for Latinas, but not for example, non-Hispanic, Black, and white women. So again, these three realms of social life all are going to impose important constraints on the work of immigrant Latinas. And we're interested not only in the additive effect of each of these, but also in their interaction. So the main objectives today for the models that I'm going to be showing you are, first of all, again, to look at each of these separately in new destinations. That has not really been done extensively before. And there's still open questions that remain within each of these realms taken separately. So in terms of the low-wage labor market, there's considerable debate. For example, dual labor market and other theories argue that the returns to things like education and skill could be a lot lower in the low-wage labor market than other sectors of the economy. So it's an open question whether more highly skilled and better educated women are more likely to work in labor markets such as these. There's been a lot of work that documents that there's a wage penalty associated with being undocumented, but far fewer studies look at the impact of legal status on labor supplies decisions. So that's another thing that I'm going to be very interested in. And again, there's a lot of work on how the family shapes Latina immigrant employment patterns. So we're interested in things like marriage and childbearing. There's also a lot of debate about whether household extension helps or hinders immigrant women's employment and entry into the labor market. There's a lot less work on the impact of transnational families. So we know that a large number of immigrant women to the United States, particularly from Latin America, leave children behind in their communities of origin. The impact that this dimension of family has on labor force participation really hasn't been examined. So I'm interested in all of these realms separately, and also in trying to get at the interaction between these different realms as well. So thinking about how things like labor market, how family constraints may vary across occupations or by legal status, and how legal constraints may also interact with family structure in various ways. So to get at these issues, I'm using data from an original survey conducted in Durham, North Carolina, actually Durham, Carver, and Chapel Hill, but since that's quite a mouthful, I just refer to the area as Durham. It's part of a larger project that was interested in understanding the relationship between migration, gender, and HIV. So we collected data in Durham and also sending communities in both Mexico and Honduras. But today I'm going to be focusing on the north of the border, part of the sample. So I'm going to be focusing on Durham. Without going into, I'm happy to talk more about the methodology if there's interest in that later. But I just wanted to highlight two important parts of the methodology. One was that we relied very heavily on community-based participatory research. So we put together a team of community members who were very instrumental in helping us create a better worded survey instrument. They also conducted the surveys themselves and helped us achieve a higher response rate, and just provided a lot of in-depth information about the patterns that we were seeing in the community. And the sample itself comes from targeted random sampling. So based on fieldwork in the community and also input from our CVPR group, we identified 49 apartment complexes, block groups. There were also a handful of trailer home communities. We identified these neighborhood and apartment complexes around the metropolitan area that housed large numbers of immigrant Latinos, and we used all of the apartment units or housing units in those areas as the sampling frame for our survey. So independent random samples of men and women between 18 and 45. We collected data in two waves. They were cross-sectional, though not longitudinal. One in 2001 to 2, and another in 2006 in the first couple of months of 2007. So the main advantage of this particular data source, again, is that through community work and other means, we really identified and very specifically tailored the survey instrument to capture the experiences not only of immigrants and immigrant Latinos in new destinations, but also of immigrant women. So we have very detailed information on employment, but also employment instability over the previous year. Things like subcontracting and informal work are also captured. And we also have very detailed information on the families that these women are embedded in. So not only things like marital status and the presence of children and other members in the household, but also information on transnational aspects of the family, so whether they have children residing abroad as well. So again, things that are not often included in other sources of data. Just to give you a little bit of a sense for the Durham context, since we're a long way from Durham here in Princeton, Durham is part of this shift that we've seen in recent decades in the United States towards the Sun Belt. So Durham has a number of high-tech employers, universities, medical centers, Research Triangle Park, that have been growing a lot in recent years, and also just general, have enjoyed the general shift in employment towards the south, right? So the overall labor market was growing quite rapidly. Durham was receiving large numbers every year of internal migrants, native labor, and the resulting demand for construction and low-skill services was a real magnet drawing Latino immigrants into the area. So particularly in the late 1990s, we see a really dramatic increase in the Latino immigrant population there. If you went back just as recently as 1990, there were really only a couple thousand immigrant Latinos in Durham. They were less than 2% of the population. Fast forward 20 years later, and there were almost 30,000 and just over 12% of the population. So really dramatic growth, again, very typical of new destinations. And these photos, they don't come out terribly clearly here, but they give you a sense for the kinds of places that we targeted for our surveys. So they tended to be clusters of apartments, not necessarily New York-style apartments, so sort of low-rise, 3 or 4 stories. But we did a lot of work to ensure that we really captured as much variation in the receiving areas throughout the metropolitan area. So we have some apartment complexes that hold thousands of units and others as few as 50. We were sure to capture not only the places with very high immigrant shares, that there were some communities that were virtually all immigrant Latino, but we also surveyed in places where only 15 to 20% of the apartment residents were immigrants. And as you see, we really covered a wide area across the metropolitan area and did a fairly decent job of capturing all of these main areas of concentration. We compared our sample with data from the 2000 census and found a considerable overlap in the kinds of demographic and immigration characteristics in the two samples. So we think we did a fairly good job of approximating a population-based estimate for this group. In terms of the data that I'll be presenting today, the overall strategy, again, it's very complicated presenting or encapsulating in any kind of succinct way the labor market position of immigrant Latinas. So you have some women who might work 40 or even 50 hours a week at a factory. You have other women who work 6 or 7 hours a week on the weekend out of their own homes cooking and selling tamales, right? So it's very complicated capturing all of this diversity. So my strategy today is to sort of walk through and decompose these various elements of labor supply. So the starting point is just simply whether or not women are working at the time of interview. We have data on this from both of our cross sections, so the sample size is a little over 1,100. The next step is to not only think about whether or not women work, but also how much are they working. So how many hours do they work in a typical week? That we unfortunately only collected in the second round of data, so the N for that is a little bit lower, 910. And finally, not only how many hours do women work in a typical week, but how many weeks do they work in the previous year, right? So we know that women are cycling in and out of employment. There are all kinds of reasons for being without work. Obviously, the latter two here are among working women only. This data comes from an employment supplement that I did during the second wave, so the N here is lower still. It's about 339. So with all of these different topics, I'm fundamentally interested again, and not only how things like economic, legal, and family structure shape these outcomes, but also in the interaction between these different dimensions. So for all of them, I'll run the models for all women, and then separately by marital status to look for differences between married and unmarried women. And I also do things like looking not only at whether or not women, but also whether they work in certain occupations relative to not working, to see if things like legal status and family constraints play out differently across different occupations. When it comes to weeks out of work during the previous year, we look at all weeks out of the labor market over the previous, also look at specifically related to slack demand. versus those specifically related to family care. So again,
Did you also interview men? So working at just a women, did you couple? Or did you pick one of the houses?
they were independent random samples. So we have a sample of men, and I've done work looking at men's labor force participation, but they were absolutely separate. So you can invite me next year and I'll present the paper on men. But yes, we have extensive data on men as well, but I won't be talking about them today. No, not necessarily. They could be their spouses, but no, they were not household interviews. They were independent random samples of men and women. Okay, so that's the basic strategy, going through a series of models. These first numbers just give you a sense for the dependent variables and how they play out across the community. So you see a little bit of a glass half full, half empty story in terms of employment. So perhaps, so nearly 58% of women were working at the time of survey. That might seem like a lot. It certainly seems like a lot compared to this image that Latina immigrant women don't work at all, but is certainly lower than numbers that you see for non-Latinos in the United States. They about 60%, almost 60% work, and almost 70% work full-time, so work at least 35 hours a week. Mean hours were also right around 35 hours a week. So the majority are working full-time, but also a substantial number are not, right? So about 10% are working very low hours, less than 20 hours a week, and another 21% are working sort of intermediate hours, between 20 and 34 hours a week. Yeah?
No, what do you mean by working?
Okay.
So I assume you mean working to pay, but you
Yes.
mentioned the example of the woman who's making tamales out of her home.
Right.
So is that?
It is. We tried deliberately to get as expansive a view of working as possible. So we asked women if they were doing anything at all for pay or to make money. So if they're taking care of their own children and no one's paying them, if they cook tamales because they eat tamales every day, that's not counted. But any work for pay is counted as working here. So when you're looking at this 10% who work very low hours, you're capturing a lot of people working out of their own homes, and large numbers of these women are also working informally. But yes, so we wanted as expansive a view as possible. That's another reason when we get to the models of hours worked, I look both at a continuous specification and a multinomial specification to see if we can see differences, across these categories as well. So yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of less than full-time hours, certainly among the women who are working in Durham, and also a lot of employment instability. So just over half of these women working at the time of interview had experienced some form of employment instability over the previous year, and the mean number of weeks out of the labor market over the past year were quite substantial. So they averaged just under 9 weeks without work during the previous year. And the reasons that people gave for being without work were quite varied. So not surprisingly, given the young age, as you'll see in a minute, just under a third cited family care, usually pregnancy, the birth of a child, or some disruption in their child care arrangements. That was the reason cited for being without work, but a substantial number, 54%, also reported slack demand as the primary reason that they were out of the labor market. So either there was no work for a particular week or more at the factory, or they were let go and had a hard time finding another job, or various and sundry ways that they were without work due to demand and not supply issues. And then there were also a handful of injuries and illnesses, and a quite eclectic collection of other reasons, things like the car broke down and they couldn't afford to fix it, those kinds of things. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on the descriptive statistics, but these are the kinds of things that I included in the model. About 70% of the sample is Mexican. The overwhelming majority of the rest of the women in the sample were from Central America, so I should confess that I'm using the term Latina really as shorthand for Mexican and Central American. The age and education are pretty typical of recent immigrant populations. I will point out again that, typical of new destinations, these are very recently arrived women, so the average time in Durham was just over 4 years, and it was something around 70% of the women in the sample had come to Durham directly from their countries of origin, so direct migrants. Very few spoke English well or very well, and the overwhelming majority, 88%, were undocumented at the time of interview. Family and household structure is also very interesting in this population. Just over a third, 35%, of the women in our sample arrived to Durham single. So this was an important phenomenon, the migration of single women. But the sex ratio in Durham is pretty uneven, and so single women don't tend to stay single very long. So at the time of survey, about 80% were married and almost 72% had children. Another really important number, fully 22%, had at least one minor child residing in their country of origin. So another very important phenomenon that we're not always good at capturing. I also was interested in, there's a big debate in the literature about extension and female employment. It was a bit of a struggle coming up with a measure of extension that made sense for both married and single women. Usually those two groups are considered separately. Basically, all single women in the sample were living in what we would consider an extended household. So rather than look at extension per se, I came up with a measure of crowded living arrangements. So this is defined as more than 2 people per bedroom in the apartment, and about 18% of the women in the sample were living in crowded conditions under that definition.
Years in Durham, is the mean the same for the 2 surveys? Because you did 2 cross-sections that you're pooling, right?
Yes, I am.
So is the years, does the duration change over time, or is it roughly the same?
It was,
Because
so,
immigration changed over this period, right?
right, and more people, the later your time period, the longer the duration should be. There might have been a slight difference by the second time that we did it. That duration might have been a little higher, but in general, in both waves, this is a very recently arrived population. And I did control for survey year. It wasn't really significant, so it's not included in the coefficients that you're going to see, but there wasn't a big, you didn't see, for example, secular change in employment probabilities over time. But you're right, that average, you would hope that it would go up over time as you're interviewing people later. That's true. But there didn't seem, right. But they do come and go, but women tend to be less mobile than men. So by the time the women come, their mobility is usually a lot lower. But that's a good point. Okay, so also very briefly, the final descriptive statistics, I just want to highlight how very concentrated these women are in a handful of occupations, right? Again, among working women, almost a third each are working in food preparation and cleaning. We have this image of immigrant Hispanic, immigrant Latinas as being very concentrated in childcare. When you look at the population level, at least in Durham, that wasn't really the case. Just under 6% were actually working in childcare. A similar number, actually slightly higher, were working in laundry, and about twice that many were working in factories. And again, very highly concentrated in just these few handful of occupational areas. Only about 16% were working outside of these immigrant Latina niches. Things like subcontracting and small firms were also fairly, well, subcontracting not so much, but working at predominantly Hispanic work sites and small firms were also fairly common among these women, although significantly less common than they were among men. Okay, so the first model looks just at whether or not women are working at the time of survey. So these are coefficients from the binomial Logit model of employment, and I want to talk first about the predictors of employment for all women, so combining married and unmarried women. And one of the things that really jumps out, or lack of things that really jumps out, is that you see relatively few effects of things like human capital and immigration characteristics on women's work, right? So in theory, better educated women with more work experience should be able to command a higher wage, and therefore their opportunity costs of non-work should be higher. They should be more likely to work. But in this population, things like education, prior work experience in their countries of origin, time in Durham, and also documentation status have no significant effect of whether or not women work. The only thing that really stands out in terms of immigration characteristics is the ability to speak English well, which does encourage employment among these women. But instead, it's really family characteristics that dominate this model. So women with children are much less likely to work, but the effect of marriage is also negative and significant, controlling for whether or not there are children in the household. Crowded living arrangements also undermine employment among these women. But again, importantly, the presence of minor non-resident children in countries of origin has a positive effect on women's work. So having kids in your house that you have to take care of and be responsible for undermines employment. But as we're seeing in this literature on transnational mothering, an important part of being a mother in this environment is increasingly the financial support for children abroad. And women with those financial responsibilities for children abroad are more likely to work than other women. So when you look just at this model for all women, you might get the impression that the only determinant really of whether or not women work in Durham is really about family structure, that these other things don't really matter. But when you look at the models,
Your negative coefficient for private living arrangements could be women doing childcare in an extended family, so that they come in and they're taking care of that, because they double up.
Mhm.
You don't know who's helping whom, so that may be a really strong way of doing it that doesn't show up in your distribution.
so do you mean they could be taking care of other women's children, or?
The way you define private living arrangement is extension, and so we know from the complex family arrangements that extension is a way that for people to invite others to live in, is to take care of children. So that's one of the doubling up that takes place at immigrant families.
Yes, absolutely. But so if other people, so that's exactly the debate in the literature. So
Informally, they're not doing it informally, so it's not showing up as paying childcare. They're doing it
right, you could be watching someone else's children. It's more common though. So that's absolutely a point well taken. You could be watching other co-residents' children instead of working outside of the home. But the women with children in Durham tend to live with other adult. I'm not sure how common that really is. So you don't know who's helping whom, but it's more common for women to live with an uncle or a sister. It's not as common for women to be living with women with children, at least, to be living with other people's children. But that's an important. Your point is well taken.
Arrangements going the other way around. The people are, because they're not working, they're less likely to be able to afford the place that's larger.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Or living in a crowded work. You could have more people contributing to the pot, and so there might be less pressure for women to work. Absolutely. There are a lot of ways that could work. It could be increased domestic burden on these women. It could be reduced financial pressures. It could be that they're doing unremunerated household production, and we don't really know. But there is an association there. It's certainly worth thinking more about. Okay, so again, when you think about again the model for all women, you sort of very strongly focus on these family effects. But there are some very important differences between the models for single and married women that are also important to point out. So I want to focus mostly on these immigration characteristics. Those are the most important here. So overall, single women are very likely to work in Durham. And so it might take some time to find a job, but the longer you're there, the more pressure you're under to be contributing to whatever household you're a part of. So you see that time in Durham is important for single women, but not for married women. For married women, it's much more whether or not they speak English that determines whether or not they venture into the labor market. But more importantly, there's an important difference here in the effect of documentation on female labor force participation. In particular, lacking documentation doesn't prevent women in general from moving into the labor market, but it does deter the employment of married women. And so the important point to make here is not only that documentation does matter for some groups of women, but also that it tends to exacerbate the difference that we see in employment rates by marital status, right? So some of what we're attributing to a difference in labor force participation rates by marital status is really attributed to this interaction between marital status and legal status. So for example, to illustrate this, I computed some predicted probabilities. This is taking the average human capital demographic characteristics of the women in Durham. And when you compute their predicted probabilities, single women are very, very likely to work. 87% predicted probability whether you're documented or undocumented. But for married women, your predicted probability for employment is only 53% if you're undocumented, compared to 67% if you're in the country legally. So again, part of what we're attributing to family structure and perhaps patriarchy really has to do with this interaction between marriage and legal status. Okay, so that's looking at whether or not, yeah.
Why do you think that's the case? If you're single women just have no choice, there's nobody else to support them regardless of their documentation stage?
Okay, there's a couple of different ways that you could look at it. So when you look across models too, you could there's the protective view and the not so protective view. So one way that you could frame this is that married women are protected by having another earner in the household. They don't get pushed into the labor market regardless of their English skills. They don't get pushed into the labor market regardless of their documentation status. And so this sort of shields them from these adverse conditions in the wider market. You could also look at it in a more negative light, that we know that, again, negotiating patriarchy is a difficult thing for immigrant women. We have this view that a sort of stereotypical view that immigrant women come to the United States, the clouds part, the sun shines, the birds sing, and they're emancipated. And the literature is much more complex than that, and it suggests that there are a lot of constraints in negotiating more egalitarian relationships, and that married women are very vulnerable in situations like Durham, and that it can be very difficult to negotiate these more egalitarian relationships. And so something like being undocumented could make it much more difficult for these women to negotiate being able to be employed and to negotiate greater independence. So,
Presumably it has little effect on men.
yes, that's correct. That's correct. Something like 97% of all men were working at time of survey. To be honest, I never ran those models for men. It just didn't.
You didn't have these categories precisely for that case, for women who are undocumented and have no negotiating power that allows them to actually stay in the country.
Right. I mean, there are the pathway through domestic violence, but absolutely, yes. Yeah.
No, I was wondering whether you have distinguished whether they married in Europe or in the U.S. or before, because they usually, this affects how they negotiate their gender roles within the couple. And in Spain, we found that was quite important, precisely regarding whether they work or not. So maybe there we are putting together these traditional reunified spouses with people who came single and married in the States and have already a different experience because they
Right,
had
very different levels of independence. You're absolutely right. So we have data on whether they were married in their countries of origin, and we also have data on whether they migrated together or separately. I've started to look at some of that and wasn't able to, unfortunately don't have the sample size necessarily to document all of those things. When you start getting into some of these more nuanced, you just don't have the statistical power to do it. But I agree with you, when with the qualitative work that we've done, that's absolutely an important consideration. Also, I was asked this morning about whether there was a difference between formal unions and consensual unions. We did collect that information. I tried the model separately by legal or consensual union, didn't find any statistical differences. Doesn't mean that they're not necessarily there. It could be a sample size constraint. So I don't want to really make strong statements about that. I would love to be able to look at that, did play around with it, but unfortunately, yeah.
So I wonder a little bit about the employer's perspective and whether you have any information about that. In other words, is it possible that employers have a preference other than equal for single women as opposed to married women? Married women are maybe more at risk of having a child and being a less reliable worker, reliable in terms of staying on the job for a given length of time.
Absolutely. So I have no data whatsoever on employers in this setting, and that absolutely could be a factor. When you look at the kinds of places these women are working, I'm not sure how discriminating employers are if they're just looking for any kind of warm body to work in the factory. There's a very high rate of turnover, for example, in factory work and things like hotel cleaning. So it could be that they don't gather that kind of information, or it could be that they do. I honestly don't know.
On single women in the labor force.
Absolutely.
And employers do exhibit in certain branches of production high preference for single or women. That was the whole thing about export processing zones, and it's very likely that it applies here as well.
Yeah, it could. So I just don't really know in Durham in particular where the demand for labor is higher and where they might have difficulty filling some of these positions. I honestly don't know. But you're absolutely right. In other settings, there's strong evidence of employer demand for single women.
Literature on women in development that you have these recurring cycles in which single women were preferred. They receded into homes in order to bear children, and then at a later age they found employment in the different kinds of labor sectors.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So an important part that I'm not able to look at. So again, the question is not only whether or not immigrant women work, but also, or how things like legal status may impede women's work, but also how it may channel women into different kinds of occupations. So these are coefficients from a multinomial logistic model of employment where the reference here is not working. And again, there are a few things that are really striking. One is, once again, the complete absence of education and other kinds of human capital, work experience impact on not only working at all, but also working in various occupations. So it's not that there's an educational threshold that you need to get a factory job over a cleaning job or childcare over another kind of job. There are basically no human capital requirements for these immigrant niches. Ever so slight evidence that Education might help you move out of niches, but overall very weak impact of human capital on employment prospects. There are some very important differences across occupations in terms of these immigration characteristics. So the longer that you're in Durham, the better able you are to move out of childcare and into cleaning, so one of the lowest wage to one of the highest wage, at least in terms of hourly wages. Also, English helps you move into some of the fields that require the most personal contact with native speakers, so things like childcare, cleaning, and also out of immigrant niches. But more importantly, again, documentation doesn't block you from entering the labor market entirely, but it does make it a lot harder for you to leave immigrant niches, and in particular pushes women into childcare, again, where wages are low and instability is high. In terms of family structure, a lot of evidence, again, in terms of difficulty balancing work and family for these women, but that balance seems to be easier in childcare and laundry work than in other kinds of occupations.
It seems like the childcare market is bifurcated. You need good English.
It's very bifurcated.
Population, and then you can do it for your comadre and do whatever trade you need. So you
Absolutely. Absolutely. So both the childcare market and the cleaning market are highly bifurcated. So you have some women, independent house cleaners who communicate with their employers one-on-one, earn a very nice hourly wage. You have others who clean hotel rooms, hotels by the room, and get paid very low hourly wages. And the childcare, you're absolutely right. You have a number of women who are nannies and earning a reasonable hourly wage, have to speak some English, and you have others who are caring for the children of other immigrant women for next to nothing, literally, $20, $50 a week for 40 hours of care. So really rock bottom, low hourly wages. So absolutely, these are very bifurcated across occupations, within occupations, lots of stuff going on there. Okay, so that's the main picture that emerges when we think about whether women work and where they're working. But again, there's tremendous variability in how much working women work. So the next step is to look at what predicts the hours that women work in a typical week, again, starting with all women. And again, one of the most striking things that you see is that human capital doesn't really matter. Neither do immigration characteristics. Once again, it's really these family structure characteristics that are determining not only whether women work, but also how long of a work week women are putting in, with married and women with children working significantly shorter work weeks. Some of the occupational things also matter. So childcare and factory work have better opportunities for longer work weeks relative to food preparation. Small firms have less opportunity for longer work weeks. But once again, we see important interactions or certain important differences between married and unmarried women. In particular, once again, there are important differences, interactions between documentation and family structure as well, presence of children. So once again, we see the same pattern that married women are more sensitive to legal status than unmarried women. So undocumented married women work shorter work weeks than documented married women, but for unmarried women, it doesn't really make a difference. Also, having co-resident children really depresses work hours for married women, but not for single women. Again, single women don't have the luxury of working fewer hours just because they have children in the house. And the impact of non-resident children is significant for single women, but not for married women. Again, you can view marriage perhaps as a protective thing. They're not as pressured to work as long hours because they have children abroad. Their husbands are also providing for these children abroad as well. And again, some occupations offer more hours for stable employment than others. But as I mentioned, and as you brought up, there's a big difference between a woman working in a factory and a woman making tamales out of her home. And so I wanted to also examine work hours in a multinomial perspective to see if the biggest differences were between women who worked and women who didn't work, or between women who worked part-time and women who worked full-time. And so what we see here is basically that women who work very low hours, so making tamales out of their home, for example, are all but statistically indistinguishable from women who don't work at all, right? There are really very few differences there. It's not until you work at least 20 to 34 hours that you start seeing this family structure discouraging employment. And really the overall, there's a much bigger break, it seems, between full-time work and other workers as opposed to between some work and no work, right? So again, the women making tamales from their own home or occasionally caring for other children in their own home, they're basically the same as women who are not working at all.
Cheryl, can you distinguish, rather than doing like our categorical arbitrary
Mm-hmm.
hours, can you make a distinction between formal and informal? That is, somebody is going to on the street, you may do it 1 week, not another week, and you may do it a lot during certain periods. Work sites over the summer when they're dealing with the poultry industries and the seasonality of that. It seems that formality also in childcare may be a way to deal with it as opposed to the conventional labor supply.
Yeah, so informality is a big issue among these women. Unfortunately, I only officially collected that in the employment supplement, so the sample is a lot smaller, which is why that's not included in these. But you're absolutely right. There's a tremendous amount of informal employment among these women. One interesting difference between women and men is that informality makes a lot less difference for women than it does for men. So, for example, men who are employed informally earn significantly less than those who are paid on the books, whereas for women, a lot of your informal employments are actually relatively high wage, things like house cleaning. Also, most childcare in the nanny setting is also informal. So, whereas a lot of formal employment, things like hotel work, factory work, don't necessarily pay a very high wage. So you're right, it's a very interesting issue, particularly with respect to wages, but unfortunately I wasn't able to really capture that here. But again, a great question. Okay, so the very last model that I look at was, again, looking at not only how many hours a week do you work among working women, but also how steady was your employment over the previous year. And again, there was a lot of instability among these women, almost 9 weeks out of the labor market. And again, a few things jump out. So the first model is predicting, so these are negative binomial models, coefficients from those models. The first one is all weeks out of the labor market for any reason. So I took the total number you were out and predicting, how these various factors affect that number. Then I added up only the weeks out of the labor market that were due to this slack demand, and only weeks that were due to childcare, obviously among women who have children only, to try and look for the pattern of effect across these variables. And again, what we see are surprisingly few human capital effects. So education does not protect you from employment instability, longer time in Durham, and having worked at Origin are negatively associated with this kind of employment instability, but not because these women are better able to avoid slack demand, only because they spend less time out of the labor market to care for children. Right, so this vulnerability to slack demand is really uniform across this population. English is slightly protective against slack demand. Lack of documentation greatly exacerbates vulnerability to slack demand. So undocumented women significantly more likely to spend a longer period out of the labor market due to this slack demand. Other again, employment characteristics, things like laundry work are more stable, small firms are less stable. But again, a real absence of human capital effects, particularly when it comes to slack demand, and another sign of vulnerability of undocumented workers. So, just to sum up, sort of as quickly as possible to try and leave more time for questions, clearly we see that each of these domains is an important determinant of these immigrant Latinas' labor force participation. Their position in the low-wage labor market is certainly a very important constraint. In this environment, it is very striking the lack of impact of human capital on all of these outcomes. Education does not make you more likely to work or to work longer hours or protect you from employment instability. Legal status is not often significant sort of among the general population, but as we'll see has some very important interactions. Not surprisingly, again, consistent with a number of other studies, family, both marriage and child rearing are both important independent constraints on Latina immigrants' labor force participation, but we also need to think very seriously about transnational elements of family because those also shape labor force participation. And again, each of these things taken separately are interesting and important in their own right, but we also need to pay a lot more attention to the intersection between these different domains. So it seems like there are really big differences across women in terms of family structure and how that constrains women's work, and family structure is important, although part of this gap, according to family structure, is really attributable to this interaction with legal status, and it actually explains a fairly sizable share of this gap between married and unmarried women. So we need to be careful before we attribute all of this to patriarchy, we need to sort of refocus our attention to how the larger legal and economic structures shape how women negotiate patriarchy in these kinds of environments. And again, both legal and marital status interact in important ways with labor market conditions. Undocumented status doesn't prevent you from working, but it does channel you into niches, and particularly into childcare, again, where wages tend to be a lot lower and instability a lot higher. And the conflict between work and family is not the same across occupations. It's also lower in things like childcare and laundry work, again, where wages are lower. So thank you very much for your attention and great questions.